Hello everyone, this is Jotto bringing you the HearthStone Weekly, bringing you the top decks, bringing you the top cards, and state of the metagame for this week's tournament. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 8 of Managrind's tournament. First place, Zen Style playing a Rogue Aggression deck. Second place, Snake Basket playing Warlock midrange. Third place, Spage playing Shaman midrange. Fourth place, Chew playing a Warrior Weapon midrange. Wow, Warrior in top 4. Ooh. Anyway, fifth, Nike playing Shaman midrange, another one. Okay. Sixth, Brian SC playing Miracle Rogue. Seventh, Reynad playing Druid mid-game ramp. And eighth, Montanks playing Druid token midrange. It's a lot of midrange. Okay. So, Zen Style's Rogue Aggro deck. Now this is a very fast deck, very hard to stop, but if you do stop it you're at an advantage in the mid to late game, but this deck is very hard to stop early game. You have things like Kobold Geomancers and Defias Ringleaders that push through early damage along with things like Wolf Rider, and the R&B Cowl helps you get through taunts, and Leper Gnome is just a good solid damage output along with Fairy Dragon. The Kobold Geomancer is there just to give spell power to things like Sinister Strike and Head Cracks to accelerate the clock a bit on this Rogue Aggro deck. And it is a very fast deck, very difficult to beat. And it got first place for a reason. Second place, Snake Basket playing Warlock midrange. This is a very, very diverse deck when it comes to mana costs. Late game, you got Ragnaros the Fire Lord and Lord Jaraxxus kicking around, and mid game, you got the Senjins and the Earthen Ring Farseers and Spellbreakers and Senjin. But anyway, it's basically it's got the standard mid range stuff, but it also has some of the early game stuff to sort of hold back the onslaught. It has 3 silences, 2 Spellbreakers and R&B Cowl, which helps with Twilight Drake. Has some endgame with the Ragnaros and Lord Jaraxxus, and some standard control, Siphon Soul, Shadow Bolt, Shadow Flame. A very well-rounded mid-range Warlock deck. Third place, Spage playing Shaman midrange. If you want to know my opinions on this deck, go to my last weekly, or the weekly before that, or before that. But anyway, the reason there's so many one-offs in this deck is pretty much the same way there's a lot of commons and rares and a lot of other decks when it should be epics and legendaries, for example. Spage, like a lot of other people, just doesn't have the cards to sort of complete a full deck right now. Some people do, but the amount of people that have a full deck that's well optimized and they have all the cards they need is very small. So we'll see this deck sort of evolve over the next month or two as he gets more and more cards. But as for now, the only sort of notable difference between this deck and the one last week is the addition of the Earth Elemental. But on top of that, something to take notice of is the lack of Lightning Storm. Now this is something which both Shaman decks sort of cut down on a bit, and it's a very interesting cut because it's widely believed to be one of the strongest AoEs in the whole game, so it's a bit odd to cut it. However, evidently you didn't need much AoE because you had enough control with Rock Biters and Lightning Bolts and Earth Shocks and Stormforge Axe early game, so evidently it works without Lightning Storm. Fourth place, Chew 8 playing Warrior Weapon midrange. Those are 3 words and I thought would be next to each other. Now, this is an interesting deck. It plays a variety of weapons. So Gorehowl, Arathi Weaponsmith, has upgrades, Fiery War Axe. It's got the slew of weapons. It also has Captain Greenskin to keep drawing your cards, and Dread Corsair you get for super cheap. And it has its finishing moves in Ragnaros and Grom Hellscream. While doing this, it also has a lot of defense in Shield Block and Armor Smith and Shield Slam. It's a very hero-centric deck with a lot of weapon-based interactions and armor-based interactions. It's an interesting deck. I've seen this a few times before, but I never thought one would do this well. But apart from that, I don't play Warrior much, so there's not much else I can comment on. Now, 5th place, Knight playing a Shaman midrange. Another one. Anyway, this one is... Okay, first of all, If you don't have a million dust, don't even try this one. Way too many epics and legendaries in here, you'll never get there. But for all those people who love churning dust out at an alarming rate, this is the deck for you. It has a ton of really expensive beatdown minions that come down in mid-game, things like Ragnaros and Sea Giant, and it's got the Tink Monster to go with Taunt. It has the one Lightning Storm, which is interesting, but it also plays the Faceless Manipulator and Onyxias and Twilight Drakes. It's just the huge amount of mid-game to late game. It has got a few early game cards like Nat Pagel and Stormforged Axe for card advantage, but the majority of the cards are played in the mid game and some towards late game. In the case of Sea Giant, he's sort of both, where he's mid game and a little late game. Just to take a note, actually, the Sea Giant in the image is the old one. I had some difficulties getting the new Sea Giant image. The new Sea Giant is 10 cost and is an 8/8. It is not a 12 cost 10/10. 6th place, Brian SC, Miracle Rogue. Now, kudos to getting a Bluegill Warrior in top 8, by the way. But aside from that, this is a Miracle Rogue deck that works without Edwin Van Cleef. Something which a lot of people didn't think was possible, so kudos to him for that. But basically what this deck does is it wins the game through Mana Addict and Questing Adventurer triggers while protecting them with Conceal and basic removal. It also plays Gadgetzan Auctioneers, Novice Engineers, and Shadow Steps along with Novice Engineer and Gadgetzan to draw as many cards as possible so that you can get these triggers off, and it's like a storm type deck for anyone who played Magic. It looks inconsistent, but evidently it isn't, because you have essentially 4 win conditions in the deck. Well, it is possible, however, if they're focused so much on those 4 win conditions, it is possible to win through aggro, as there's quite a few aggro minions in the deck. So it's sort of a split attention, where the kill condition is not obvious in this deck, but is evidently there. 7th place, Reynad, playing Druid mid-game ramp. Now, for anyone who hasn't seen this deck before, as a lot of you, Druid mid-game ramp is all about the 5 to 7 drops or 5 to 8 drops, but you play a lot of ramp in it, like Innervate and Wild Growth, so you basically power everything in the mid-game, so it's like a mid-range deck with a lot later drops. It's an interesting sort of hybrid between late-game beatdown and mid-range. But it plays a lot of removal, like the Swipes, the Starfalls, and the A-Bombs, which is basically removal, while playing a bunch of chunky minions like Ironbark Protector and Hogger and Ancient of War, Druid of the Claw. Just a lot of big stuff in this deck. This is a beatdown mid-range deck that is fairly unique in the metagame because Druid is sort of the beatdown guys of the metagame if you want to go in that direction, and it's an interesting deck to see get this far. Very interesting deck to try out. Now, 8th place, Montanks, playing a Druid token midrange deck. This is an interesting hybrid between midrange and tokens. Now, the token side of this are Knife Juggler, and Force of Nature, and Imp Master, and Savage Roar, and R&B Cowl, arguably. But then the mid-range parts of it are Keeper of the Grove, by the way, 4 silences. Wow, that's a lot of silences. Keeper of the Grove, Violet Teacher, Druid of the Claw. There's a lot of mid-game and the obvious Sen'jin. There's a lot of mid-game and a lot of early game. So it holds off aggro decks by using tokens, and it also gets in earlier with the token generator. So it has an edge over other mid-range decks because they have to spend a bunch of removal on it when they really want to power out their mid-game minions. It also has a bit of an edge on aggression decks if it draws the token cards, because token cards are very cost effective versus mid-range and early game decks. So it's an interesting sort of hybrid in Druid, and we saw 2 completely different Druid decks, and both of them worked fairly well. We had 7th and 8th from 2 completely different Druid decks. So, top 5 neutral cards: Sen'jin, Shieldmaster, R&B Cowl, Ragnaros the Firelord, Earthenring Farseer, and Gadgetzan Auctioneer. So, what are we starting with next, you say? No, I'm done. No, not talking about it. Alright, I'm back. Sorry about that, just had to go stop myself from saying Senjin again. No, I'm not going to talk about it. You can't make me. There's nothing you can do to make me talk about the stupid card. It was played in 5 decks. If you want to hear my opinion on this, go to every single other video on this channel. I think it's in every single one. Maybe every single one. 95% of them. But anyway, I'm going on to an actually interesting card. R&B Cow. Talk about a mute swing for me. Seriously, this is my actual channel mascot. But anyway, R&B Cow is a 2-mana 2/1 with Battlecry Silence a minion. The most underestimated battlecry in the whole game, I feel. Now, this battlecry does way more than people think it does. It was played in 3 decks for a reason. It stops Twilight Drake, it stops Senjin blocking your way, it stops the crazy Doomsayer that no one plays card. It gets over A-Bomb, I think, is a major one. A-Bomb is actually a card which, if it's played against an aggro deck, they're basically dead unless they have an R&B Cow. And it's very cheap. 2 mana to silence something. The 2/1 body, it's just icing on the cake. The actual main part of this card is silence a minion. Used offensively, defensively, it's a very versatile sort of bread and butter. It's a bread and butter minion in ways that Senjin could only hope to be. Ragnaros the Fire Lord, the first legendary on here. Now, it basically has pseudo charge if you think about it, because as soon as you play it, it does something at the end of your turn. This died off in the Cockatrice metagame because of a certain big game hunter that was lurking around a bit, but no one has big game hunters right now, so this has got its reign for a couple of weeks. Once big game hunter becomes popular, I think this will die off a bit, but for now, it's an 8/8 for 8, so it's very hard to attack. And at the end of your turn, it just kills something, or takes a massive chunk out of your life. And it's up to a flip of a coin. It's another one of these RNG effects which can decide games sometimes. The interesting thing about this is that Ragnaros versus Ragnaros wars basically end based on luck. Usually the person who plays Ragnaros second has the best chance of winning the match, because if that Ragnaros hits your opponent's Ragnaros, then you basically won. Just because there's not much it can do to it apart from Big Game Hunter, which Big Game Hunter is not around right now, so besides targeted spot removal like Mind Control and Assassinate, there's not much you can do to this thing. Once Big Game Hunter comes out though, I think that card will be played a lot, and this card will be played a lot less. But people just don't have Big Game Hunter right now. Earthen Ring Farseer. I know it costs 3 mana, but do not be fooled. This thing is a mid-range card. It helps against aggro decks by healing you up a bit. It helps with Warlocks because it can sort of compensate for the life taps you do on turn 2, and if they have an aggro minion it kind of sucks because you're down to 25 life. But this thing also heals up mid-range minions, and that's a big deal. This is a mid-range card. This is not a aggro card. It looks like one, but it's not. This is a mid-range card. It's a defensive minion most of the time that can put the beats on, and that's all the 3-drop has to do for me. 3 mana 3/3 just has to put down the beats while having a battle cry that does something. So that was played in 3 decks, all of which were mid-range decks. Gajikstan Auctioneer. Now Gajikstan Auctioneer has been widely sort of looked at like a rogue card, but it's not a rogue card. It is actually played in a lot of decks. It was played in the Warrior one this time and a rogue one, but this is a card which is very underestimated because I think it should be played a lot more in a lot of different archetypes. Now, the reason I think that is because this is card advantage of any spells. It don't have to be rogue spells. That's the thing people need to realize about this card. For a warrior, for a mage, or for a shaman, it draws them a couple of cards, and that's all it needs to do. The interesting thing is, though, that Azure Drake is much more consistent than this card, so it's a bit odd that this is here and Azure Drake isn't. Azure Drake, I think, is better in most situations since you have a lot of cheap spells, so if you're a shaman or a rogue. If you're a shaman or rogue, this thing draws you 2 to 3 cards, and then you refill your hand, and it's awesome, and you get a bunch of cards back, and everyone loves them. But with Azure Drake, you get 1 card back, so it's a lot, but it's guaranteed, so it's a lot better with decks that have expensive spells like Mage and Druid and things like that. So I'm a bit surprised to see this here instead of Azure Drake, because I think Azure Drake is more sort of versatile. However, this is very good in this sort of spell spammy decks, and spell spammy decks do exist. Now, this would normally be where the state of the metagame is right now, but the state of the metagame doesn't even exist. Why? Because if you want to see what the state of the metagame is, you go on my last tournament recap, and then make it 10 times worse. There are 6 mid-range decks in the top 8. Just think about that. And it's not an anomaly, this happened for the 7th tournament in a row now. The only class that doesn't play mid-range is Rogue. That's crazy. That is actually crazy. Mid-range has completely dominated all the classes apart from Rogue. I think Rogue aggro is stronger than Rogue mid-range, but that's just because the Rogue spells are so cheap that they complement aggro better than they do mid-range. But the rest of the classes, mid-range is so much more powerful than aggro or control. Control is still dead in the border, and the only aggro decks that are still working are Rogue decks. The rest of them are too inconsistent. Rogue looks like it's the king of the format right now, but realistically, the problem with the game is not necessarily rogues. The problem with rogues is mostly come from the coin, where if a rogue goes second, they almost always win because the coin is incredibly overpowered right now. Going second is better for most classes, but for rogue it's even worse. But actually, the other problem with the game is the mid-range neutral minions. The mid-range minions in general are very, very overpowered. The neutral ones are extremely pushed. That's the problem right now. But even the class ones, like Fire Elemental, is arguably one of the strongest minions in the whole game. And it's just so powerful compared to its other sort of counterparts, like Stormpike Commando. The mid-range minions are running rampant right now, and that's something which they need to change in some way, otherwise it's going to keep up and it's probably going to get worse. But anyway, as for now, this has been Jotto. I do a show once a week, and I also do another series called the HearthStone Hospital right now with Tali. Those will be coming out 1 or 2 a week. If you like the content, please subscribe and give me a like maybe if you want to. If you have any feedback, put them in the comment section below. But as for now, this is Jotto, signing off.